All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to our speaker series, where we invite thought leaders in election research, public policy, and voting reform allies to not only showcase their work, but provide opportunities for us all to discuss the many advances in election science. My name is Nina Taylor, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. And before we get into the presentation and fireside chat, I wanted to review a few housekeeping rules. We are streaming live within our educational platform StreamYard as well as YouTube. This series will kick off with some introductions and move into a foundational presentation of ideas, and then open up with our moderator asking questions of the panelists. We will be collecting your questions along the way. Feel free to use the chat to ask questions of our presenters, and you'll see your questions woven into the discussion portion of the series, the speaker series. Whether this is your first time joining us or you are a seasoned vet, we ask that you remain respectful of our presenters and each other. While we have our differences in opinion, we would like to ensure that our educational environments and all engagements remain professional, open, and respectful of all participants. Any non-compliance of our code of conduct, you will find yourself unceremoniously ejected. At the end of the presentation, you can expect from us an evaluation. We'd love to hear what you thought of the presentation and any ideas you may have for future web series. In this critical time in the reform community, I would like to ask you to continue to support our work. You can make a donation to the Center for Election Science on our website, and we encourage you to become a monthly donor. Thank you to everyone who supports our work in kind, in donation, and sharing our work with your network. So let's get into our event. I'd first like to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Lea Merivaki is an associate teaching professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and an associate research professor at the Massive Data Institute. Dr. Meraviki's research interests lie in the intersection of election science, voter behavior, and political communication. Since 2020, Dr. Merivaki has been co-directing the Election Officials Communication Tracker, a massive data collection and insights-driven initiative that tracks all state and local election officials' communication efforts on social media. And Dr. Mara Suttmann-Lea joins us today. Dr. Suttmann-Lea is an associate professor of American politics at Connecticut College, specializing in elections. Their work is driven by an interest in strengthening access to and confidence in American democracy, and ensuring all those who wish to participate in the democratic process have the correct information needed to do so. They are also the founder of the podcast, What Voting Means to Me, which features interviews with people from different walks of life about their experiences living in a democracy, and conversations with scholars and election officials about what can be done to improve the health of American democracy. And our moderator for the conversation today is our very own Dr. Whitney Wah, the Director of Applied Data and Research at the Center for Election Science. Full biographies of our panelists can be found on our website at electionscience.org. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Suttmann-Lea to provide some foundational context prior to our fireside chat.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I think that if we can just go ahead and get the slides going, I promise you there are not many, but we wanted to give folks some background on the work that we're going to be presenting today. So Dr. Merivaki and I have been engaged in voter education research for the last 5 years. And most recently, we have been spending a lot of time trying to understand how election officials can communicate and connect with their constituents in ways that not only increases trust, but bolsters trust and confidence that might already exist. And so that's what we're going to be talking with you about today. And if you go to the next slide, please, that would be great. So I think it's helpful, as always, this is very professorly of me, to give a little bit of a definition. So we affectionately call ourselves Team Voter Education because voter education is what we are all about. And the question that undergirds our work is pretty straightforward. How can election officials build a healthy election information ecosystem? So we see voter education as containing multiple facets. On the one hand, yes, at its most straightforward, it is information about how to physically vote. How do you register? Where do you register? If you're casting a mail ballot, how do you make sure that it gets cast and ensure that it gets counted? Those kinds of pieces of information. But we're also really interested in looking at the work election officials are doing to inform voters about the process and then link the process to the outcomes. What are election officials doing to inform voters about the security measures that they take to ensure that elections are conducted with integrity? What do these communications look like? Which ones are the most effective? And so, with that foundational definition of voter education, we are exploring both the resources available to election officials to allocate to voter education and trying to identify the ways in which they actually do engage with their constituents, both online, as we've already talked about very briefly, as well as in offline spaces. And so we're really exploring this currently within this environment that is still dominated by election mis and disinformation and polarization and perspectives about election security. So our big question that we are considering over the course of this election cycle and that we've been thinking about for the last couple of years is how does voter education impact both the voter experience, the experiences they actually have at the polls or casting a mail ballot, and in turn, confidence in election administration and integrity. Next slide, please. So we are looking at the communications shared by election officials primarily in online spaces because it is one of the most accessible ways of capturing these communications. And we're trying to see if there are both educative effects that the efforts of election officials to communicate with their constituents about how to vote, what's needed to register, et cetera, actually help reduce errors and mistakes that voters might make, and in turn, cultivate more positive voting experiences. When this happens, we think that this can translate into higher levels of trust. If you have a good experience, or even maybe an experience that just isn't that memorable, you just go to vote and nothing goes wrong and everything's fine, you're more likely to have confidence that at least your vote was counted correctly. Of course, we're not only asked to think about whether or not we think our vote was counted correctly. We want to know, were votes in our county counted the way that they were intended across the state, across the United States? And so research tells us that confidence in this counting process decreases further away from home. And so we're exploring how trust building campaigns can help voters connect the process, how elections are actually administered, to the outcome, that election results are by and large accurate and elections are secure and safe here in the United States. And of course, we're exploring this both for folks who show up to the polls, who are voters, but also non-voters as well, folks who might be observing the election process but not necessarily be able to participate or choosing not to participate. Next slide, please. So the last thing I want to offer before I turn it over to Dr. Merivaki is just to give you guys a picture of what our data measurement efforts are looking like these days. So what we have here is a map of social media usage by election officials on Facebook and Twitter. Now, this was during the 2020 election, and we have now updated this. And so this map is going to look a little bit different for the 2024 election. But what you see here, if you look closely, is that most election offices at the local level are not on social media. Facebook is the most common. Twitter/X is the next most common. But we have a long way to go before we see election officials across the United States having an active online presence. The same is not true for state elections, state election offices, but it is very much true for local election offices. At the same time, because we don't have a repository of spaces where election officials are entering data and telling us researchers the kinds of communications that they are engaging in, this is sort of the best available baseline we have for capturing voter education efforts. One really important note about this map, you'll see that Wisconsin and many of the northeastern states don't have any colors marked in them. This is because elections here are not run at the county level. They are run at the municipal level, where the social media presence is even less. Yay, federalism. Elections are very complicated in the United States. So with that framing, I'm going to turn it over to Leah to wrap things up here with our introduction, and then we will take some questions.
Thank you, Mara, and great to be here. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So the first step in this major project that we have to understand voter education in a more systematic manner involve procuring a database of election official accounts so that we can map the presence. So that map was an example of that. And the next step is to understand and observe what elections officials are talking about on social media. Whether there are any patterns across and within the states in how specific topics are discussed, and predictability, say when voter registration deadlines approach, early voting deadlines, election day, so information during critical times. So we can observe what elections officials are talking about, but we can also identify strategies in how specific topics are discussed. We can identify messages that are being prioritized when it comes to promoting specific information. And we also are able to identify strategies to address very difficult issues such as misinformation. So what I have here is a few examples of the efforts that we have over the course of 3-4 years about how state election offices, in this case, are communicating to voters about what is needed to vote, voter ID, misinformation and getting the facts, and important dates. So our data collection process allows us to identify presence, but also understand how elections officials communicate. So step by step, we are able to kind of chart that territory of what it means to be online and what it means to educate voters on in digital spaces, including social media. We can go to the next slide. What we learned from 2022, we were very grateful to have received funding from MIT to launch our tracker, and we replicate those efforts this election cycle. We labeled and tracked communications by over 2,000 accounts by state and local elections officials across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter between September and November 2022. And our efforts helped identify trust-building strategies specifically related to misinformation and election integrity. So we were able to categorize those efforts into 3 buckets. One of them involves communications about trusted sources, so how election officials position themselves as experts in the election space, and they should be trusted. That is consistent with efforts from other organizations like the National Association of Secretaries of State with a Trusted Info campaign. The second bucket that we identified was trust the system or the process, that our elections are secure, and that is why you should feel confident that your vote will be counted accurately, all the different safeguards, and a lot of signaling words there to attach to those messages. And last but not least, we observed an effort to humanize. So other than efforts to show how professional election officials are and how professionalized the profession of election on running elections is, also that those are people that are part of your community, they're your friends and neighbor, and you should trust that they know what they're doing, and they also care about democracy just like you. So the predominance of those campaigns and those messages were used by the research team in 2022 to connect to outcomes. So we were able to test how those affect attitudes about ballot accuracy, namely whether voters felt confident that their votes were counted accurately in 2022. And we did find a positive and strong and positive relationship, which is great news. And it really suggests that those efforts matter, and that what elections officials are doing in digital spaces can play a big role in infusing the election information ecosystem with accurate information that can help voters build resilience, but also get informed about how elections work. We can move to the next slide. So with this research, we put together a list of best practices and recommendations, and I will not go over all of them right now, but I expect we will have time later to delve a little deeper. But our goal is to recommend strategies for effective communications that do not involve a lot of money, because we know that elections offices are under-resourced and understaffed, but some little tweaks that are actionable and easy to implement that can maximize how exposed this presence is to voters, but also can minimize potential perceptions about how biased an election office is, because, face it or not, many election officials are running on partisan labels, and they might be perceived as partisan by voters. And also strategies about how to navigate posting across different platforms and conveying the best message. So we took it back to the election community, and we got feedback, and we're working with federal agencies and election officials themselves to help them build those best practices into their communications. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. So we're happy to report that those efforts with this foundation were able to receive funding for 2024. And now we are officially launching what we call the Election Officials Communications Tracker. We hope to put out more timely information about what we see as we monitor and track what elections officials are saying. And thanks to Public Agenda, we received funding, and we are also in the works to launch a dashboard for others to interact with our data. So we hope to be able to do that sometime in September, right before we get all too excited with voter registration and absentee voting and all that fun stuff. And we can have others interact with our data to see this variation across the states and also within them. Thank you. We can go to the next slide. So what else we're doing in this cycle? Those are observational data. We observe what elections officials are saying. We collect the data, but we're also interested in testing in other, experimenting with other designs and testing the effectiveness of those messages on voter confidence. So these are some other things we're doing this cycle. And we're building a lot of connections with the election official community, because first and foremost, we do this because we want to contribute to democracy, but we want to help and better support this community. So we build a lot of partnerships and trust with this community and other stakeholders who are also invested in supporting and providing resources that can help election officers with communications. And hopefully this will allow us to build more capacity to collect data on what election officials are doing on the ground, because as Mara said before, it is very difficult to find every jurisdiction. We have over 8,000 local election jurisdictions, and find what everybody's doing online and offline, and we cannot ask them because they're busy, and that takes a lot of time. So this allows us to build some infrastructure for data collection, and we can build our efforts to understand a little bit more holistically what it means to educate voters offline and offline. So with that, I will pause, and we're very, very excited to answer any questions you have for us. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for providing that context and for giving such a great overview of the important and excellent work that I think you both are doing. And clearly, if you check out their bios, they are sincerely experts, right, in election science. The best part is the ability to translate academic findings and research, right, and actually want to do good with it, right? And so making that accessible for election administrators. And so we have some great questions here, and we will start with James, your question. In a recent Zoom call, the presenter spoke of the idea of ranked choice voting. Great. Their conclusion was it was hard for voters, and the voter would just not vote. So do you have any thoughts on ranked choice voting or any of the other different voting proposals, which I think ties very nicely into kind of a topic of the impact of varying voting laws across different states and jurisdictions, right?
Mara, you can get us started. Yeah, you can jump in.
Like went to say something off the get-go. Thoughts on ranked choice voting. Staying agnostic, at least in terms of my comments about my own personal perspective on ranked choice voting, I think that the concerns about voter confusion are completely valid. And at the same time, I think that with proper resources and insight about how to communicate and connect with constituents about how to use ranked choice voting, if it's something that state legislatures or voters through referendum choose to adopt, it's something that can be learned and can be adapted to and adjusted to over time by the voters. So when we think about the impact of electoral reforms, this is the central theoretical contribution that Lea and I try to make. We always have to think about who's intervening. And political campaigns, political party organizations, yes, they do inform their supporters, but there are information gaps that need to be filled. And we have not yet empirically explored the impact of voter education on success and use of ranked choice voting. But we do have reason to believe that some of the strategies we've identified for election officials will translate into effective voter use of that reform.
I can jump in a little bit and say that I agree with every new policy. No matter how we perceive it as accessible, or another policy to make it more convenient, there's always the burden of informing voters on how to use it, so that the benefit is actualized. And ranked choice voting is one of those reforms that it is tricky, because it's very different from what voters have been used before, and how they are asked to cast their vote and evaluate candidates. So it may run counter to the whole two-party system that we're very used to. I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from Alaska. So where we're having our eyes out in reports from researchers who actually were asked to evaluate the system, and how Alaska did their work and identify which gaps there were with respect to how voters were educated. And I do expect with this kind of reform there will be a lot of trial and error and some learning process. And this is, if we take some of the lessons from the direct democracy literature, the educative effects that are long term, sticking with it, and voters would learn how to use it as they did with other reforms. But a key factor here is letting voters know how to navigate it. So how we help them get used to how new technology and voting technology works. This is another thing that, unfortunately or not, has to be added to the list of things that voters need to be educated about.
So would you say that education translates to voter engagement? So, obviously these changes and the diverse nature of a federalist system, right? How can officials best navigate these changes, right? And also maintain high levels of voter engagement. Is it just through education, or do you imagine there being more to it than that?
So I will say that let's start by saying that election officials care about voter education a lot. So when it comes to changes, and it depends on the change, when it comes to changes with voting technology, election officials have some ways to get that information out. So there are demonstrations that they make, and that they can publicize how election technology works, and they're very creative in how they do that. So I can see that part of this education campaign is to just do videos where this is how ranked choice voting works, and this is how we do it. And there is an empowerment there for voters. At least that's what we see with our students. And when we talk to other voters, when they do interact, they say, it wasn't that hard after all. It's actually very cool, and that can breed engagement. And spreading the word out that this is something that is available and others use it. So, trying to find those trusted messengers to help build this, to amplify that work, that is very important. But I mean, education is key. So we cannot understate how important that is.
And I will also add that I think in terms of thinking in terms of the future of election reform, both in terms of front-facing reforms that affect voter access, like ranked choice voting and other more accessible voting reforms, or changes that limit access to voting, as well as back-end processes. Something that a lot of folks in election science are exploring are the educative effects of hands-on experiences, doing facility tours, seeing how mail ballots get processed. And so, just for one example, and so there's some pretty promising preliminary evidence that this not only engages voters in a way that goes beyond just, well, I'm engaged through the act of voting, but I'm actually invested in the infrastructure of democracy. But it also bolsters their confidence. Skeptics walk out of facility tours feeling more confident. And this is including among folks who are more likely to be skeptical. So I see the future of voter education in response to any sort of election reform as incorporating where resources are available. Of course, time and money are very, very precious for election officials, incorporating those kinds of activities. And sort of my dream would be to see an ethos of voter education and interest in the process of administering democracy take hold in the broader public as a means to give folks the skills to adapt and learn to electoral reforms, which as long as we're all still breathing, there will be electoral reforms.
Love that. And I think there's a great interest in our audience too about kind of how to account and really consider the many differences, right, that we can imagine and also you see on the ground, right? So to highlight, I think it's Jack's comment right there on why do we have so many differences in ballot security across the states? And if we have a minimum standard for, gasoline, why can't we savor democracy with a minimum STD I should just say STD, I'll say it out loud. Yeah, okay, for ballot security. And I think that's a great question. And it really ties in well into kind of what these trends, if you can speak more to the trends, right, as far as navigating all these different voting laws and reforms, because as we exist, there will be reforms.
Yes. So Leah, I can go ahead and get this started by offering and forgive me if this is a little pedantic, but offering the sort of 30,000 foot view from a structural constitutional perspective of why we have all of this variation, not just in election security laws across the states, but in voting laws. And I tease my students often and say, if anyone ever asks you, why are American elections so complex? Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. The long and short of it is we have a constitutional system that largely reserves the conduct for running elections. Those powers are largely reserved to the states. Now, that being said, there are, of course, exceptions to that rule. We had the 15th, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the 26th Amendment allowing for 18-year-olds to vote, and then different pieces of federal legislation like the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act. And so it isn't that there aren't federal interventions that have offered some kind of standardization across the United States. It's that when we're talking about the constitutional hurdles to get over and resistance from states, both Democratic and Republican-led states in terms of election administration, combined with political polarization and differences in perspective on what ballot security should look like, you kind of do get this stalemate where you see different states adopting different practices. So that's my 30,000 foot overview. And Leah, I'm sure you have some perhaps more specific.
Yeah, I would start. If we were in person and we could interact in a different setting, I would ask, what do you mean by ballot security, right? But there are some things that states are doing uniformly, thanks or not, and in spite or despite of federal interventions. So logic and accuracy tests, so checking technology, if it's working and how it records votes before election day, that's something that is required, and all states and local jurisdictions are doing it. Voter list maintenance practices, all states are doing it, and that's part of ensuring that voters that are eligible can cast their vote. So there are safeguards, and something that the election community is realizing more, and that's what we see in research, is that voters, because of the positive experience at the polls, are able to associate their experience with with the accuracy of their ballot, so being counted because you vote physically and you can see it. But we also see a big gap in how confident voters feel when they are asked, what about votes in your state broadly or nationwide? So many would say, I know what is happening in my state and in my jurisdiction, but I don't know what others are doing, and therefore I'm not confident that votes elsewhere are counted. So in response to this mismatch, the election community broadly has kind of reshaped the messaging to kind of highlight that all states have these processes. So there might be some minor differences in, let's say, how we do signature verification and how we train poll workers. All of these are related to security in one way or another, or how we design absentee ballots and what information we ask. There are, insofar as ensuring that eligible voters are only able to vote and that the votes are cast and counted accurately as voters intended. There are procedures that are uniform and that are federally mandated and state mandated, because all states have this is a priority. And we have metrics to evaluate that. We compare recorded votes to election outcomes, how many voters check in, how many votes are recorded. There are audits. I didn't even mention that. There are post-election audits that are more and more used, paper ballots used in the majority of election jurisdictions in the United States. So there is some uniformity. But that said, there is also a lot of variation.
And I think that by way of sort of tying a bow on all of the amazing details that Leah just laid out, it is important to emphasize that, yes, there's federally mandated actions that are uniform. And there's also underlying principles. So the specifics might look different from state to state, but the underlying principles of election security and integrity are very similar, if not completely uniform across the states. And so I think that really, captures the different aspects of those security measures that Leah was talking about. But yes, it's always good to what do we mean by ballot security and what aspect of the process are we thinking about? Because there's a lot of different ways that we could think about that particular question.
Yes, and I think at this point, it would also behoove us to discuss even more so about the research that you do. So V asked a question. So it sounds like your research is focused not on election reform itself, but on the role and impact of voter education by election officials on voter trust and engagement in whatever process is currently used in their state. Has either of you done research on whether education efforts by other entities such as watchdog type agencies have had an impact on similar outcomes? And so I think this would be a great opportunity to expand and really delve into the expertise you both have in this area and more about the research you do for our audience.
Absolutely. I can just start really briefly, if it's okay, Leah, and offer an answer to that last question and say we collect data from election officials that might link to other entities or other democracy stakeholders and amplify the messages that they are putting out there. And so we have means to gather information from these kinds of entities when we are exploring that with election officials as sort of the locus or the hub in terms of where information goes out. But we have not actually looked at any sort of relationships at this point, but it's a really important question. But I think that Leah, if I may put it back over to you, perhaps you can also give that 30,000-foot overview of what we do have some pretty good concrete empirical evidence for and insight on that we can offer.
Yeah, thank you. So we started this research thinking about who is a core actor in the election information ecosystem and who is by design the expert in the process, and therefore they are a trusted source, and that's election officials. But something that we have been observing is that there are a lot of trusted message surrogates, right, and other organizations who are have a vested interest in amplifying this work. So we have third-party organizations like the League of Women Voters. They have their Vote11.org, I think, campaign that is aimed to amplify this research and has adopted all of the same messaging that election officials are your trusted source, that there are safeguards in place. We have not examined that directly, but that's the next phase of this research. And we do, one of our expectations is in the respective communities, because there are specific electoral groups and communities that respond better to other messengers. So we need to understand that a little bit better so that we know what partnerships election officials can build and how better to reach those populations that might be by default or through their experiences might be more distrustful of election administration. So that's the next phase where we can understand, especially for underserved voters, how other messengers and through their efforts, they're able to amplify the work. They cannot, we argue that they should not substitute the work because, again, the election officials' role is very, very important in this information ecosystem. But we know that other organizations who, again, they have good intentions and they're good faith actors, they have a very important role to play.
Great. And I'm going to try to combine a few what I think are related questions that Stas asked earlier, just more so about the research, kind of your knowledge and expertise in this area, right? About do we have recent reliable polling data on voter feelings about election integrity across different regions? And if so, what are the takeaways? And I think this goes nicely with Kevin's question that he says is a bit brainstorming, which we as academics, we love a brainstorming question, right? And just wanting to kind of hone in on that distinction between the voter experience, right, on the individual level, and then what happens, right, and kind of breaking that down, right, as far as what they experience personally, very locally, and then the second they watch on the news or something that takes place on the national or state level, like how does that is like that a different part, right, of voter confidence and in building that. And obviously that speaks to, you know, what research has been done, what research you have done. And so hopefully that kind of ties well with Sass's question from earlier as well.
Thank you. I can start on that. I know Kevin personally, and it's such a Kevin question. Hi, Kevin. And we are examining that. So, and Kevin is right. So there are 4 ways we measure and we study voter confidence. Is confidence that your vote counted, confidence that votes in your jurisdiction, your county, your community counted accurately, votes in your state, and votes nationally. And our research, our framework, the way Kevin used this word, our framework is that the further away from home, the more national and other factors shape attitudes about confidence. So the voter experience is a major role, and that's why election officials have this relationship at the local level with their voters. They interact with them on a day-to-day basis. Voters call their office, they go to request absentee, they just interact with it more, and their personal experiences shape how they feel about their actual vote. Then as we move further away, we cannot use the same theoretical framework because there are other factors. What we're really trying to understand, and it is easy to theorize about the national level because there are all these narratives, and we do see a very strong relationship between election denial and voting behavior for specific candidates and confidence. So those are very predictable, actually. What we're trying to understand a little better is what are those factors that help us understand why voters express such a strong confidence that their vote counted, but lower confidence that votes in their own jurisdiction counted when it is run, by the same election administrator and rules. And what about the state? We identify differences in how voters evaluate their state and local election officials, which make us, uncover some of the dynamics between how those are perceived by voters, how they are trusted. And of course, and I know Kevin is very interested in partisanship and impartiality of election administrators, and we suspect that this is a major factor. And we're examining that. Mara is a Carnegie Fellow, and this year we're examining this polarization, partisanship views that we have state election officials who use their personal accounts, and they talk about elections and how secure elections in their states are, but they also advocate for specific initiatives, and they use their partisan hat. That really confuses voters. And we expect that there's some of these dynamics that are playing that may be explaining why confidence lowers significantly, and that requires different types of interventions and strategies to bolster communications, because perhaps communications are not enough, and there might be some other things that need to be implemented to just restore trust that and across the nation. And one of them I mentioned before is coordination across the states, that all states have safeguards. Elections across the states are secure because there are all these things that offices are doing, and that's why we should be confident that votes are counted everywhere. But at this, the transition between community, state, and national, this is what we're trying to flesh out a little bit more, especially in this cycle.
That was an excellent summary of a lot of research on voter confidence, Dr. Merivaki. Thank you so much. I think that the few things that I would like to add are to reiterate that, yes, when we move away from the personal, the local, confidence decreases. And a lot of this has to do with perhaps, we're exploring this selection cycle, the ways in which officials in other states present themselves, the way that they are presented by folks in their own state. I also, though, want to point folks to this general phenomenon, sort of the broader theoretical principle that might underlie these differences that we're exploring, which is that folks tend to have more positive evaluations of phenomenon, people that they know, that they're close to, that are quote unquote close to home. There's a very well-known paradox in political science. I'm getting super nerdy here, called Fenno's paradox. Folks tend to, on average, this day and age, things might look a little different, but have higher approval ratings of their own individual member of Congress than they do of Congress as a whole. And so if you extend that logic to, gosh, I know my local election official, or even, my Secretary of State, they seem like a great person, they're here in my home state. That looks very different than being asked to consider and form an evaluation about a system that might look very different, someone that you don't necessarily know, not that we all know our election officials personally on an individual basis. And so that's the foundation and sort of the barrier from which we're working. And then we add on top of that misinformation and polarization, and it makes it a really complicated question to address.
Great. Excellent questions are coming in, and I'm just trying to keep up with all of these. And so I think a great kind of segue would be going into the topic of strategic communication, right? And so obviously when we consider the differences in voting rules, right, and voting laws, reforms, right? But what about diverse voter populations, right? So what are some best practices for communicating with diverse voter populations, not just in the context of varying voting systems and laws across states, right, but across different communities, perhaps communities of color and other demographics?
Yes, and I want to say that we have some work that speaks to the impact of voter education, specifically on communities of color, young voters, first-time voters, not necessarily looking at strategies that are targeted specifically at those groups, but we have some evidence that shows that there is effectiveness in helping close the gap between the knowledge and likelihood of making mistakes, et cetera, that some of these groups might experience. In terms of addressing this question, though, I want to just start by saying that it's important to identify the problem and what the problem looks like. And that looks different for different groups. So let's take voters of color, particularly Black voters in the South and in other jurisdictions across the United States that have a history of voter discrimination. That history does in some ways live on in the consciousness of these communities. And one of the biggest hurdles that election officials face, who are well-meaning, they just want to help folks vote, is helping these communities overcome those generations of mistrust of a time in American history where you could score perfectly on a literacy test and an election official could still say, nope, stamping you has failed. I'm not going to register you to vote. So we really need to think about the specifics of what these community needs. Take young voters. They're first-time voters. They are going to need a little bit more hand-holding. Having your local election official or some surrogate, maybe a student organization, come to your classrooms, engage in nonpartisan voter education efforts and voter registration efforts can go a long way. And so I think it's really important to remember that there are unique needs that each of these communities have. And by identifying those needs and those problems, that's how we move forward.
I would like to add to that is that something that we observed when we started our tracking project is accessibility of information. Yes, voters have different needs, and at minimum, information should be accessible and available to everyone, regardless of their needs. So we have been able to map a lot of gaps across states and localities in how they communicate with voters and what information is and is not accessible. So whether information is multilingual and it corresponds to needs about language minority voters, whether there are information is accessible, like links that others can click on, or alternative text and images. So posting information out there is useful, but the frame of mind should also be that they're voters with with different needs, and we have to make sure that they are also able to access that information. And so that is very important that we're evaluating that. One more thing that I wanted to add is that is based on our experiences as educators with students. So we run registration drives and we work in different states with Professor Suttmann-Lea. So I used to be in a state in Mississippi where there's no online voter registration, mail voting is complex, and the same applies with other states when it comes to first-time voters and young and student voters, college student voters whose registration needs are a little bit different. They move in and out, their identification might be different, and therefore voter education is so important, and so is bringing the election officials into those communities and getting to experience what it's like for those students, because sometimes and that taps into descriptive representation, who our election officials look like and what is the typical voter in their mind. And sometimes there's a big mismatch between what election officials think their voters need and what they actually need. And we are fleshing those out a little bit more. So this allows us to bring a lot of our experience with teaching and how we interact with our students to communicate that to election officials, because those are definitely underserved communities, and they need to be brought into the process. And that will translate in the long run into confidence and, of course, increased participation. And you mentioned that, Whitney, before.
Right. And we can't really talk about, I guess, we all have individual biases, but as in, certain demographic groups also have biases and also different levels of trust as, differing baselines, right? So, but we can't talk about biases without partisanship. And so that taps into a question we got from Brian previously on, do political statements about the other party cheating significantly reduce trust in elections? So speaking more to the role of partisanship, right, and the increasing polarization we see today, how does this impact, the work that you're doing and in terms of reducing voter trust in elections and shape the type of voter education efforts, right, and the information that is conveyed, right, to different groups? And obviously party is it's a big bias, right, in terms of how people process information. There's been prior work, and maybe you could speak more to that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the short answer to that question, and this actually comes from research that Dr. Merivaki and I have engaged with, that's outside of our own, is that accusations of cheating and fraud amplify the factors that already make someone more likely to have less confidence. So we know, for example, if you select a candidate that loses, especially at the presidential level, your brain might try to convince you, oh, there must have been something wrong. We saw this in 2016. Many folks forget when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. Of course, this was very prevalent in 2020. And these same themes are being recycled here in this election cycle. And so there is some empirical evidence out there that suggests that when there are these accusations of cheating and fraud, that the other party is cheating, that only sort of amplifies the factors that make you already more likely to question an election outcome. Fortunately, though, Leah and I have some observational evidence suggesting that communications from state election officials in particular can provide folks with a sort of insulation or protection from the more pernicious effects of misinformation, like accusations of cheating, or even just the effects of selecting a losing candidate. Their baseline confidence might not be, or their confidence might not be as high as their counterparts in that same state who selected a winning candidate or who have had more positive voting experiences, but they're still higher than folks living in states where election officials aren't as communicative.
Well, I was looking at the comments, and thank you everyone for being so engaged. I wanted to say that it is obviously realistic to expect that there is an impact on voter confidence, because voters are asked to pick a side, and therefore, you want your candidate to win, and the winner-loser effect is what we call it, is real. There is a big difference between feeling that something was often that your candidate should have won and accepting the outcome of the election. This is where a lot of the process is important for voters to understand. Not only that, just take the word for granted that, oh, our elections are secure, just take our word for it, but communicating how and why the process are secure. And if there are legitimate concerns about elections not being secure or outcomes not being accurate, there are procedures to evaluate that, starting with the audits and whether there are any with provisional voting and recounts. There's so many processes that consistently show or flag whether there are any issues with that would be the first piece of evidence to suggest that maybe there's something wrong. And of course, there are other measures that evaluate whether there's any I don't like to use the word cheating, but if there's any inconsistencies or any, I guess, wrongdoing in many at different parts of the process. Another thing that I would like to note is that our research focuses on making sure that voters are informed and they are empowered to make their own choices based on accurate information and nonpartisan information. And election administration should be nonpartisan because the goal is to facilitate access to voting, and not with respect to making easy for everyone to vote, because that's not something that election officials have the power to do. That's state legislators, but their job is to make sure that voters have the tools they need to navigate the process and have a positive voter experience. So it is, but it is also important to recognize that there is definitely the narratives about how insecure elections are. We have to recognize that some of the elites and the political candidates are communicating those narratives, and we have to recognize that. And data do show a persistent relationship between voters who associated with specific parties and candidates and how they feel about integrity. That is not okay because the process should work for everyone. And this is something that we're trying to understand a little bit better. But there, other than the actors that we identified before, election officials, watchdogs, there are other stakeholders, including election officials and political candidates who run for office. And many times they don't have experience with how elections work other than what do I need to do to submit my campaign finance documents? What do I need to do to put my name on the ballot? I can get out the vote and let my voters know that they need to vote that date and the next day. But many of the processes, they may not be familiar, and that is very easy to question when you don't know. So with a bucket of voter education, we welcome for campaigns, political parties, candidates to also get included there, so that we hopefully go on the same page on how the election process works and all the different security features that it entails.
And speaking on the kind of the different players, right, in this process of process of educating voters, making sure that they have reliable information, and the various challenges of that. Amanda asked a question earlier on just where does the role of reform fit in, and education about electoral reforms, particularly versus RCV and approval voting, right? These different types of electoral reform. These are obviously not the only electoral reforms, and because this specifically focuses on voting method, right? But how does that fit in terms of these additional players, right? So how do we get that information and education to voters about reform? And kind of, yeah, we'll let you speak to that question. Great question.
The short answer is political actors who are trying to win elections or help people win elections will start talking about reforms when it's advantageous for them to do so. And forgive me for being so cynical, but that's sort of a general principle. If there's not strategic incentive to promote certain kinds of reforms like ranked choice voting, then politicians and political parties aren't going to do that. I think this is a really great chance to flag a new piece of work out by Rick Hassin, who is one of the preeminent election law experts in the United States, who essentially puts forward an argument that actually engendering an affirmative constitutional right to vote would go a long ways to incentivize political actors, party organizations, campaigns, and candidates to be more active and bipartisan in promoting and supporting different kinds of election reforms. So I don't mean to be such a cynic. Lea, perhaps you have, Dr. Merivaki, perhaps you have a little bit more of a rosy outlook. But that's the view that I tend to bring to my classroom sometime, much to my students' chagrin.
Yeah, so this is a fair question, and if we look at the history in the progressive movement and all those different reforms that were implemented, that were like open primaries and replacing the caucuses, there are. If I were to teach my political parties class, I would say that reforms that perhaps challenge the dominance of the two parties, those might be reforms that might not be that popular for broad advocacy. That said, RCV is gaining steam, but there is also one of the reforms that has been attracting a lot of concerns about how it might benefit one party or the other. And that's why we see some inconsistency in who is advocating for it and how many are advocating for it. So Fair Vote is one of the most consistent groups that are pushing for RCV across the states. And there are some states and local jurisdictions that are experimenting with it. But I would say that why we're not perhaps seeing more is because it could be challenging the two-party system and how candidates are able to compete based on what we have traditionally. And also, we also have what we call the laboratories of democracy. That's how we describe federalism. Sometimes another approach is to just wait and see how it works in other states. And, if we see that it's working well and enough, then we might jump on the bandwagon and advocate for, universal, which it's never going to happen, at least in our lifetime, but more diffused policy across the other states in experimenting and adopting RCV, as it was with online voter registration, with DMV registration before the NVRA was adopted.
Right. And we are already pushing up, and I knew it too. I was like, I think we can talk for days, but I won't do that. Maybe. I'm just kidding. So for kind of like a concluding question, and it ties into Mike's question, I think a little bit. So as we approach the 2024 elections, what do you believe are the most urgent actions that need to be taken to safeguard voter trust and engagement, particularly with social media companies, right? So when we're talking about interventions, right, to combat misinformation, social media is definitely in online spaces, right, is going to be where the battle for information takes place and goes down. And so should they be held accountable also? Is this part of, that should definitely be, I think, one of the urgent actions, I would imagine. But if you think that you are cynical, Mike can give you a run for your money. So I think I'll leave it to you for your concluding thoughts on this.
I will say that the first, in terms of some urgent action items, funding and support for elections. So there are little pots of money every now and then that are aimed to support states in how they run elections. There's very, when you actually translate it into how many dollars per voter these are, this is very, very little. So election officials are asking for consistent support for elections, because not every state allocates a portion of their budget to elections and not consistently. So there's a lot of inequality across the states in how much they receive from the state legislature. And there's always need for more, because the needs of running secure elections increase and the threats to security increase as well. And also election officials are experiencing unprecedented challenges. They're threatened, they're harassed, they leave the profession. So retaining recruitment, securing elections, it requires a lot of funds. So sustainable funding is a major, major action item that the election community needs. And we have more. Yeah, Mara, you can talk about others.
Yeah, I will second that, and also highlight work by one of our colleagues, Martha Kropf, Zach Moore, who have a book out actually about how elections are and actually aren't well funded, but resources is a consistent complaint that election officials have, because resources for staff and for communication support and teams give them time to combat misinformation in a moment in history where social media companies aren't necessarily being held accountable for perpetrating misinformation. So I think about this question in terms of urgent action items, both in terms of short-term interventions that we can take, and Leah and I will have hopefully have some stuff in the field here to identify specific messaging strategies that election officials can put out there, but also just remembering that this is an ongoing conversation, that supporting and protecting voter trust is not something that happens through the process of opinion change necessarily or only, but it's something that we can build up as a foundation. And so, remembering that voter education is an ongoing process, and that there are, with proper resources and support, election officials can protect their voters. Protect is a great word. Insulate, inoculate, whatever word you want to use, from the more pernicious effects of misinformation can go a long way. So I think if I were to hammer one point home, it would be continued support for the work of election officials to get their message out there, and for the amplification of that message from other democracy stakeholders and folks in different opinion leader networks.
Well, thank you everyone so much for, oh, wow, right on time. This has never happened for me before. But thank you so much for everyone for really such amazing questions. It was tough to get like through them all. There were so many that we weren't even able to get to. And so I just want to encourage you all to check out the survey. It will only take 3 to 4 minutes, I promise. I designed it myself. So, and I think the link is accessible there, but if not, I'm going to share a QR code. I'm not sure. Can you guys see it? I'm not sure. There it is. So yes, awesome. Thank you all. And thank you so much to our experts. Here's the audience applause for
Thank you all. It was great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Great. All right. Live it up.